In this episode, we talk about the money bill route, which helped bring in the controversial electoral bond scheme. We also talk about the death of a protester during the ongoing farmers' protests near the Delhi-Haryana border. But first, we talk about a previously unknown factor that might be affecting India's air pollution. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Every year during winters, North India witnesses some of the highest levels of pollution in the world. Delhi, for example, gets a lot of attention, but a lot of cities that lie along the Indian Gangetic Belt witness a significant rise in pollutants. And while cities in the West and South India are also polluted, they come nowhere close to their northern counterparts. And this has been the norm for a number of years now, except in 2022, when things did not follow their usual pattern.
What was noticed in the year 2022 was that Delhi and some of its surrounding areas, some of the cities that were observed, especially those in NCR, they were seen to be much more cleaner than usual.
That's Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha, who reports on science and technology for the paper.
That is the concentration of the PM 2.5. Those concentrations were significantly lower than what is generally observed during this time.
And simultaneously, what was observed is that cities in the west and south of India, like Mumbai, Bengaluru, and Chennai, their concentration of PM 2.5 was much higher than usual.
Especially Mumbai was quite high. Mumbai's air quality, in fact, the PM 2.5 concentration in 2022 winter was almost 30% higher than normal. So there was an anomaly, there was an observed anomaly, a deviation from normal, and there was no very good explanation of why this had happened. In fact, that was the first time that Mumbai pollution hit the headlines everywhere. And on certain days, the AQI or the air quality index in Mumbai was poorer than even Delhi. This we are talking of 2022 winters.
That is when people started to look for explanations. How was it that Mumbai's air, a city next to the sea, was witnessing higher pollution than the capital? To answer this question, two research organizations started to look into the matter. The Bengaluru-based National Institute of Advanced Studies and the Pune-based Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology.
Led by, one of the most well-known air pollution experts, air pollution scientists in India, Gufran Beg. So he led the study, and they have just now published their findings about what might have happened.
And what these researchers have found is that weather events like El Nino and La Nina could be partially responsible for what happened in 2022.
Most people in India are now familiar with these La Nina and El Nino phenomena. These are ocean atmospheric interactions that are created by the unusual warming and cooling of the Pacific Ocean.
These two events are what significantly influence weather events across the world, including the monsoon rainfall in India.
And it is fairly well established now that an El Nino phase, which is the unusual warming on the eastern side of the Pacific Ocean, that leads to a suppression of monsoon rainfall over the Indian region. And conversely, when there is a La Nina phase, then that helps to bring more rainfall on the Indian monsoon.
But Amitabh points out that prior to this study, there was no correlation between these two weather events and the air quality in India.
So what happened was during 2022, there existed a very strong La Nina, and it was one of the record-breaking La Nina events. Usually La Nina or El Nino, they continue for about 7-8 months to a year, and then they fluctuate and there is a neutral phase in between. But this particular event that we are talking about, 2022, this particular La Nina had been extending for 3 years at a stretch. 2022 was the third year. So it was one of the longest phases of La Nina and also quite severe. And what the researchers here found that the La Nina event probably had some influence over. It caused some changes in the normal air circulation pattern over the Indian region.
And this is what the study says may have contributed to the air pollution patterns changing in the country that year. According to the researchers, this extended La Nina could have changed the wind patterns significantly.
So instead of moving from northwest to southeast, the winds were moving from north to south, right? So it was a sort of straight going down. The winds were moving from north, from up towards south, which is going towards southern India or peninsular India. So what happened was that the pollutants that were originating in Punjab and Haryana, mainly because of crop burning, they did not go to Delhi. They bypassed Delhi and instead flew over Rajasthan and Gujarat, and then they moved into peninsular India. A lot of it actually found their way into Mumbai, and that's why the Mumbai pollution levels rose sharply. So to be clear, what happened was that Mumbai and Delhi, their local sources of pollution were generating the pollution load normally, as happens everywhere. The external pollutants that were coming into Delhi did not go to Delhi that year. Instead, they flew to Mumbai because of a change in wind direction.
And according to the researchers, like we mentioned earlier, this change in wind direction was most likely caused by the extended La Nina.
So La Nina itself does not create any new pollution sources, of course, that is quite clear. But what it did was that it changed the distribution of pollutants from the normal level to a changed level. And that's why we saw that Delhi was slightly cleaner while Mumbai was slightly dirtier than normal in 2022. This is what the research has found.
Though besides this, the other thing that contributed to Mumbai's poor air quality was the change in local wind circulation. The sea to land and vice versa air circulation that usually ends up removing the particulate matter took much longer that year.
So Mumbai was getting cleaned every 3 days. Now it was getting cleaned after every 7 or 10 days. So because of which the pollution load in the city, increased. So it was getting cleaned after 3 days. Now it's getting cleaned after 10 days. Obviously, the air quality in city was worsening during this period. So this change in the local air circulation within Mumbai, that also researchers say could have been influenced by the La Nina event, right? So there were two different changes. One is a more large scale change in wind direction over northern India. Instead of blowing from northwest to southeast, it came from north to south and transporting the pollutants along with it. And then there was something happening locally within Mumbai, which was delaying the cycle of air circulation at the local level. And both these events, the researchers think, could have been caused by La Nina.
And again, just to be clear, La Nina did not cause the pollution in any way. What this study says is that it most likely changed the wind patterns that carry the pollutants from one place to another.
Also, we have to be clear that this El Nino and La Nina happen frequently in cycles. So right now we are having an El Nino event right now in the Pacific Ocean. Now, not every El Nino and not every La Nina will probably have the same kind of influence over wind patterns over India. This particular La Nina event was very special, as we mentioned earlier. This was one of the longest ever La Nina, also very, very severe. Also, the impact over wind patterns was observed only towards the end of the La Nina period. So remember, we said in 2022 it was already in the third year. And if La Nina had an influence on wind patterns, we should have got the same kind of changes, probably should have been observed in the previous year as well, 2021, but that wasn't observed. So what researchers say that there might be a sort of an accumulative effect also happening, that La Nina might not be severe. The strength of La Nina or its impact over India might not be evident in the first year, but as it continues over a prolonged period, the accumulative impact led to this kind of result, which we saw in the year 2022.
So, which means that not every La Nina or El Nino has the potential to affect India's air quality.
Now, both El Nino and La Nina known to be getting severe under climate change scenarios. The projections are that if temperatures continue to rise under different kinds of climate change scenarios, both El Nino and La Nina events are likely to get more frequent and severe. So what the researchers say, and again, we must point out this is just the first study that has linked this, and a lot more needs to be done in this regard. But what the researchers say is that if La Nina or El Nino, since they are projected to become more and more severe over the years, it is possible that their influence over wind patterns in India also gets stronger, which means there would be an external factor influencing the distribution of pollutants over the Indian region. And therefore, India would have a new sort of influence to deal with as it tries to control air pollution. So that is a new sort of dimension that has been added to the air pollution problem in India.
And next we talk about the money bill route. Last week, in a historic judgment, the Supreme Court struck down the electoral bond scheme as unconstitutional. For those who may not already know, the electoral bond scheme is what allowed individuals and companies to anonymously donate money to their preferred political parties. But even as the top court did that, even as it struck down a scheme that, according to it, was violating our right to information, it left out one aspect of this issue for another day. And this is the aspect that allowed the government to introduce the electoral bonds in the first place. This is the money bill route that enables the legislation to bypass the scrutiny of the Rajya Sabha. Now, when we spoke to Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath, she explained that money bills are nothing new. In fact, every year, the union budget, for example, is passed as a money bill.
So constitutionally, there is a provision which deals with what a money bill is. Because it deals with important fiscal aspects of the executive, there is more power that is vested in the Lok Sabha, or all the power is vested in the Lok Sabha, which has the elected representatives to the parliament. And that is how you can bypass Rajya Sabha, or where Rajya Sabha's approval is not really needed. So if you look at Article 110 of the Constitution, any bill can be termed a money bill if it deals with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 criteria. And that criteria includes whether, say, something is related to taxation, or whether something is related to the borrowing of money by the government of India, or any other financial obligations undertaken by the government of India, or there is any payment of monies into the Consolidated Fund of India and the Contingency Fund of India, or any other expenditure, raising of receipts that involves government spending essentially, right? And there is a saving clause which says, and any matter incidental to any of these matters specified in clauses A to F. So in addition to what is explicitly allowed in the Constitution, any other matter incidental to those can also be classified as a money bill, is what the Constitution says.
But she says that there is an important catch here. The provision in this case says that the decision of whether something counts as a money bill or not lies with the Speaker of the House.
The provision actually says, if any question arises whether a bill is a money bill or not, the decision of the Speaker of the House of People thereon shall be final. So which means the Lok Sabha Speaker certifies something to be a money bill or not. This the government interprets to mean that there can be no judicial scrutiny. So if you look at what was happening in 2014 when the Modi government first came into power, they did not have numbers in the Rajya Sabha. The Rajya Sabha was still largely controlled by the opposition. And for key legislations to be passed, there was a roadblock. Either you have to build consensus or those legislations would not have been passed. So it is then that along with the union budget, the government began passing a number of key legislation as a money bill. So the big example of that, or one of the first examples of that, was the Aadhaar bill. right? So Aadhaar was passed as a money bill. And the government's ostensible reasoning for that is, this relates to subsidies, and subsidies are given from the Consolidated Fund of India. So that is how it's related to government spending. This brings in safeguards into government funding. So this can be a money bill, is what the government argued. And that, however, was challenged in the Supreme Court. And now we are in this situation where the Supreme Court has to decide what is the extent of the Speaker's powers. Can the Speaker decide any bill to be a money bill, right? Or are there limits to it? What are the contours of those powers?
And Apurva, what is the reason that a money bill is allowed to pass the scrutiny of the Rajya Sabha? What is the reasoning behind allowing this for things related to financial matters?
Because it is inherently about, government spending, right? So it relates more to the elected representatives. For example, a government not being able to pass the budget is considered a vote of no confidence. So when the budget is being passed, that is essentially showing strength in numbers of the government. So this power is then vested with the House of Peoples and not the upper house, which is the Council of States, Rajya Sabha. Rajya Sabha, we must remember, is indirect membership to the parliament, right? They are not elected directly by the people. There is no direct electorate there. Whereas Lok Sabha, the parliamentarians in the Lok Sabha are directly elected by the people themselves.
And you mentioned that the Aadhaar bill was something that was passed through the money bill route. What are some other examples of this from the recent past?
So the PMLA amendments that came in, these are crucial amendments that 2017 finance bill, that is during the budget, another provision was brought into the PMLA. Here again, the government says money laundering and these relate to tangentially, it's a matter incidental to government spending and monies of the government. So that also the amendments to PMLA. But here there have been crucial amendments on, what kinds of offences are included under this umbrella money laundering provisions. So these changes the government brought in through the money bill route. Again, you have the service conditions of tribunals. This is something, again, the government brought in through the Finance Act. So say a tribunal, say like NGT or any of these quasi-judicial bodies, what is the term of the member of the tribunal? How can they be removed? Their tenure being regulated, how they're appointed. These aspects the government passed as money bill. Again, here the government's logic is that their salaries, which form part of their terms of employment, that comes under government spending. So that can be, a money bill. So earlier, you've not seen such extensive definitions of what can be a money bill and what cannot be. But now with the Modi government, you've seen that expand drastically. For example, the electoral bond scheme, right, that was brought in as a money bill along with the union budget. So these things have then been challenged in Supreme Court, and now the court will have to decide. Larger 7-judge bench will have to decide what really is a money bill and what is not.
Right. So based on what the Supreme Court decides about what counts as a money bill and the kind of powers the Speaker should have regarding this, could it affect the laws that have already been passed using the money bill route?
Theoretically, yes. Like, for example, the Aadhaar Act was upheld by a 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court. You had one judge, that is the current Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, who dissented in the 5-judge bench. So 4:1 margin, the government won the case. One of the grounds of challenge was, of course, this money bill aspect. Because you could not have passed it as a regular bill, the government sought to pass it as a money bill. So that aspect was challenged. In the dissent, Justice Chandrachud, of course, calls it a fraud on the constitution. And he disagrees with the government's view that this could be a money bill. But if you look at what the majority opinion says, the 4 judges, they don't really go into this question of, whether it is right for the Speaker to certify this bill as a money bill or not. So there isn't a lot of detailed discussion on this aspect, but it has been largely upheld. But when the same aspect, the money bill aspect, came up in another case, which, like we earlier discussed, the service conditions of tribunal. So that was another separate case before the Supreme Court. When that was being heard, the bench said that service conditions could not have been money bill. But the conflict inherently was Aadhaar was a 5-judge bench. This bench, which was looking into service conditions, was also a 5-judge bench. So the court had to refer the matter to a larger 7-judge bench. Because if 2 benches of equal strength decide on an issue in one way or the other, then a larger constitution bench will have to settle the law on that aspect. So Aadhaar is one such law that can be, theoretically undone if the Supreme Court decides on this money bill aspect.
And she says that this would be the case for the PMLA legislation as well. even though it was upheld by the Supreme Court earlier.
Of course, these two legislations, the challenge to which government won, so they could possibly be overturned depending on how the Supreme Court reads the money bill issue. But electoral bonds, of course, the court has struck it down as unconstitutional. But still it saves that one ground of challenge. Justice Khanna in his separate opinion does mention that because a larger bench is seized of this issue, that the court is not going into the money bill aspect. So it may not have an impact on the electoral bonds case, but definitely on some of the other legislation that has been upheld earlier, those will still have its day in court.
And Apurva, how would you say the government is framing this issue, and in what way do we see it actually playing out?
So in India, the parliament has its own legitimacy and there is judicial review. And we have what we call a limited judicial review, which means a law made by the parliament is presumed to be constitutional unless the court decides otherwise. So here, when the constitution specifically says, if any question arises whether a bill is a money bill or not, the decision of the Speaker of the House shall be final. So the government would want to frame this in the context of the remit of Parliament, whereas for the other side, it will be on the extent of judicial review. To what extent can courts examine these provisions, right? Any constitutional authority, for example, does not or will not enjoy unbridled power, which can be used in patently illegal manners, for example. But we do have certain powers granted exclusively to, say, the Speaker of the House in anti-defection, the governor in some cases while recommending, say, President's rule. So there are these pockets of powers that the Constitution gives to these constitutional bodies. So that debate will essentially be power of the Parliament versus the extent to which the court can review the decisions of the Parliament.
And in the end, we talk about the farmers' protests. After a protester died of head injury at the Kanori border yesterday, the farmers' protests were suspended for the next 2 days. Several farmers were also injured as the Haryana police once again dropped tear gas shells at both the Shambhu and Kanori border. When we spoke to Indian Express's Kanchan Vasudev, she told us more about it.
Shubkaran Singh, he was 22-year-old youth from Ballo village in Bathinda district. He became the first casualty of Delhi Chalo protest, as he died due to head injury. He was at Kanori border. As the security forces, they lobbed tear gas shells and fired rubber bullets from that side of the border on Punjab-Haryana border. Shubkaran sustained a fatal injury on the back of his head. He was taken to the hospital and he was declared brought dead. So this Shubkaran, he hails from the farming family and is the only brother of 2 sisters and his mother is not alive. And the information available with the doctors is that a rubber bullet had hit him.
And Kanchan, do we see this affecting the talks between the farmers and the government?
Shubkaran's death is going to affect the talks because when the news of his death broke, at that time the farmer leaders were in a meeting which was being mediated by ADGP Intelligence Jaskaran Singh. The center had invited these farmer leaders for a dialogue, 5th round of dialogue. But when the news of the death came, the farmer leaders, they stormed out of the venue of the meeting. And they said that they don't want to engage in the talks because the center was inviting them for talks at one point and the Haryana police was firing at the protesters on the other. And with the firing, they lost a young farmer.
Right, and besides this, we understand that another person got seriously injured yesterday. Talk about what happened there.
It was after Shubkaran's death that the farmer leaders, they announced that they are going to march towards the Haryana border. When they started marching, the security personnel at the Shambhu border, they lobbed tear gas shells at the farmer leaders also. As a result, Jagjit Singh Dallewal, he was injured and he has been now taken to the Rajendra hospital. He's already suffering from a disease and now he's admitted because he's unable to breathe. That's what the latest development is in the case.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.